Welcome to the production of Raum, production of space, my first video essay and one of the very few video recordings I have made in this key. It is not titled accidentally, after the famous book by Henri Lefebvre. Also, the video is made after the talk given this summer, this July, in Munich, FREIMANN, in the space of alternative educational project of der Fahrende Raum. In the public talk given by Jelena Vesic and myself, we wanted to shed some light on the historical context and concepts used in this year's der Fahrende Raum educational campaign. I would also like to express my gratitude to der Fahrende Raum project for inviting Jelena and me to be the part of this educational campaign. The kids of FREIMANN were offered a dozen or so of images, photos or video stills from the artworks by the several generation of Yugoslav conceptual artists active from the late 1960s throughout the 1970s, and some of the works would be from the 1980s as well. Then the kids would, out of this pool of images, select the few they would like to recreate, or better say reenact, themselves. Within this research, we wanted to understand how what was formerly known as the temporary status of alternative approach or alternative offering became a permanent category to which certain politics are being sentenced to remain alternative forever. That is, to be clearly marked as something never to become a mainstream, never a viable option, never a prevailing paradigm. We find it important for thinking about the future of der Fahrende Raum and similar propositions. In the first part of this talk, Jelena Vesic spoke about the distinct system of accessible amateur and do-it-yourself clubs and magazines as the part of particular social infrastructure of Yugoslavia. Important to add, our talk and the entire approach towards trying to answer the question of der Fahrende Raum drew substantially from the research that Jelena and me did for the text titled 1984, The Adventures of the Alternative. It was published in this year's volume of the edition by L'International journal, dedicated towards examining the 1980s as the decisive decade, as the place in time from which most of the concepts shaping our contemporaneity are coming from. Our text paid a special attention to the trajectory of the word of alternative being the one of the important words, terms and concepts that came to mean almost the opposite from how we understood it before. From the text. This is expected normal continuation of the process through which the very concept of alternative seems to be appropriated and twisted beyond recognition to outline today precisely that one worldview that does not allow for any alternative than itself. The debate on the trajectory of alternative towards alt seems to be mostly concerned with examining the role of the two elements that seem to determine the present situation: the rising power, sophistication and uncontrollability of media, the problem of technology, and the sense of diminishing ability of formal democracies to address this or any other problem. Further, in this talk, I would like to examine one case study to offer you the three quotations by Henri Lefebvre and one by Lily Lynch, and to play you a significant commercial from the 1980s. A note on Lefebvre. All the Lefebvre quotations are coming from his well-known title The Production of Space, published in French in 1974. It gained a worldwide popularity after being presented in English in 1991. Ever since, the generations of critical thinkers grew a habit of rediscovering this title over and over again. At least reading what was possible to be written in 1974 reveals that one thing must be true, that this sense of being under the siege is precisely that, just a sense, that this sentiment did appear throughout the history and by itself is not a new thing, and finally, that this feeling of the end of history and of the overwhelming victory of ideology over both nature and culture cannot stand for any reality now, as it couldn't stand for any reality before. So let us remind of the almost uncanny actuality of this description that could have been written a week and not almost half a century ago. Few people today would reject the idea that capital and capitalism influence practical matters relating to space, from the construction of buildings to the distribution of investments and the worldwide division of labor. But it is not so clear what is meant exactly by capitalism and influence. What some have in mind is money and its powers of intervention, or commercial exchange, the commodity and its generalization, in that everything can be bought and sold. Others are concerned rather with the actors in these dramas: companies, national and multinational, banks, financiers, government agencies, and so on. In either case, both the unity and the diversity, and hence the contradictions of capitalism, are put in brackets. It is seen either as a mere aggregate of separate activities or else as an already constituted and closed system which derives its coherence from the fact that it endures, and solely from that fact. Besides providing this significant historical orientation, Lefebvre would go on to propose understanding space in its various forms as something to be produced, or we can also say created, rather than something that is already there. It does correspond with what we observe in nature, where space is indeed something that is being produced in largest quantities ever measured, and something that is produced at speeds almost unimaginable. As science says on nature, the universe does not expand into anything and does not require space to exist outside it. So is the case with social space, Lefebvre would claim. If we know one thing, it is that we need to be careful with using too much of a direct analogies in comparing the matters of nature with the products of culture. It is always ungrateful to do a literal comparison between the two. And with nature we have big troubles understanding this, but we understand it more and more, that space is not something that just sits out there, that exists by itself, waiting to be filled with stuff or not. As any production presupposes some method of production, some kind of technology, so does the production of space. Here we got curious about the media technologies and their trajectories of development. These things, the various size rectangles that became mandatory in all situations, is what caught the most of our attention. Important to note, and this is something we better keep repeating throughout this year, is that this technology is now only 10 years old. There were no smart things in our pockets before the summer of 2007, when Apple presented the first iPhone. From November of 2018, a present moment, to November of 2008, when the people were presented with Android, the operating system that runs on 80% of all mobile devices now, it is a perfect around 10 years of distance. After the first 10 years, we look at the numbers. There are different methodologies, different sources, but they are all pretty much in agreement. So we see that we already spend approximately 2 hours and 15 minutes in applications per day, which amounts to approximately 1 month per year. In only 10 years' time, this technology managed to control 1 month of each and every year of our lives. And it is just warming up. The history of technology, or more precisely, the histories of technology, is where we can look for clues how what is happening now can be taught in a different, alternative manner, and how it can be guided in a different direction, if we find the present state of affairs unsatisfactory and something to be improved upon. Let's go straight to 1984 now. In the early 1980s, the arrival of personal computers was still something to be speculated upon. This era presented the peak of broadcast television, and computing was the field that emerged laterally. Computers were not really sexy, to say, at the time, and were not expected to be found at the top of the poles of new cultural paradigms or technologies to change all life and work. To advocate advancing of personal computers was considered an alternative approach at the time. In January of 1984, New York Times published an analysis of the media campaign that by itself presented a kind of tectonic change in advertising. The 1980s used to break a lot of paradigms, but here we can also speak about the multiple change of paradigm or about a change of several paradigms at the same moment, more precisely by the same act. The campaign was launched by, at the time, new and upcoming, daring and risky, and certainly alternative company called Apple. It was run by someone about to become a household name, Steve Jobs, the charismatic leader, inventor and media personality, the propeller and the creative genius of the company he will turn into a global corporation soon. This, as a difference from most of the other alternative motions at the time, was a campaign against the old corporations and only indirectly criticized the state. In what today reads as a cynical anecdote, Apple made a move in behalf of the people against the massive corporate force of IBM because of intrusion of privacy. The commercial was broadcasted during the Super Bowl, the finals of American football. It was then, as it is now, the most watched broadcast and the most expensive advertising space on the planet. Let's see the ad now.
Raiders 28-9.
Today we celebrate the first glorious anniversary of the Information Purification Directives. We have created, for the first time in all history, a garden of pure ideology, where each worker may bloom, secure from the pests, obeying contradictory laws. Our unification of the laws is more powerful a weapon than any fleet or army on earth. We are one people, with one will, one resolve, one cause. Our enemies shall talk themselves to death, and we will bury them with their own confusion. We shall prevail.
On January 24th, Apple Computer will introduce Macintosh. And you'll see why 1984 won't be like 1984.
The magic of CBS Sports Sunday is the WBC Super Lightweight Championship, World Cup Skiing, and the World Speed Skating Championship.
What we could see at the surface of this story: the smashing of the central screen by the young hammer-wielding heroine liberates the technology and puts it at the disposal of the people who are otherwise stuck in a grey, Orwellian and obedient world. The spectacular commercial announcing the arrival of the new technology was directed by Ridley Scott, who behind himself already had the titles like The Blade Runner and Alien. But the issues we are faced with using these technologies today, the issues of ownership and control, of tracking and privacy, were not really the topic of this campaign. It was promising something else. It manifested the arrival of a particular form of individualism that would be expressed by everyone's inherent creativity once the interface towards the complex and complicated computing machinery is being resolved. Less obvious was that this creativity about to be expressed would foster the emergence of the unprecedented industry that in less than 2 decades would globalize and monopolize the world. It will determine almost all aspects of life and work and give the new corporations more control and more power with less accountability than IBM could even dare to dream of back in 1984. Today we all seem to be both the witnesses and the products of the results. But we can use Lefebvre's advice once again to understand this as yet another form of illusion, as he observed in 1974. Does this imply the coming into being of a clearly defined space, a capitalist space, the world market, thoroughly purged of contradictions? Once again, the answer is no. Otherwise, the system would have a legitimate claim to immortality. Some over-systematic thinkers oscillate between loud denunciation of capitalism and the bourgeoisie and their repressive institutions on the one hand, and fascination and unrestrained admiration on the other. The 1984 campaign used a lot of subtext, implications and psychoanalytical tools to make its points, and it was tremendously efficient in its aim. But this is another topic, and in this occasion we would like to analyze the emergence of certain urban myths that will come to form the new paradigm, the one which we live today. The consequences of all this were probably not obvious at the time to the very actors of the computer scene themselves. They have seen their rise from the garage, a place soon to become a mythical source of alternative, do-it-yourself, self-propelled and independent artistic propositions and all technical innovation, as a sort of a genuine bottom-up, emancipatory and horizontal motion. Garage was not only the ideology, but also the material source of the emergence of both the myth and the very real power in operation today. It also became a place to legitimize the new form of capitalism. This one was examined under the name of Californian ideology at first. Today it is once again simply capitalism. This is the iconic photograph of two Steves, of Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak, who was actually the tech guy behind the early Apple products. Garage would come to symbolize the guerrilla tactics that brought to the fore the entire field of alternative music and media, the entire spectre of emerging technology, and the sense of time spent together in alternative communities. It also brought to the fore the two new figures, of entrepreneur evolving to become the philosopher of our times, and of hacker, of someone confident and sovereign and able to find their way through the hostile and complex world of contemporary technology. This had also redefined the idea of genius. Before, the idea of a genius was mainly the one of a master in depth of a certain field, of someone devoted to science and contemplation, and, as it goes, of a frequently reclusive and enigmatic person. But from now on, the genius will be a hypersocial person with mythologized instincts, able, first of all, to create profits. The new genius will also have to be very creative, but in a special way. This sort of creativity is about disrupting the old and establishing the new financial order. The new genius now has to be proven through profit, and he will be running the company. The former gig genius will have their place reserved in the genius bar or with other production or service-related tasks. And all this was about introducing a new form of socialness. Also, this photo is very 1980s. It symbolizes entering the era of strong images. But this is another story for another occasion. I'm glad that I can juxtapose this strong and historical image with another image, less known but at the time equally powerful. In this picture we see Voja Antonić, the inventor of Galaxia computer, and his colleague Jovan Regašek working together in what is decisively not a garage. This photo was made in Belgrade probably in 1983 or 1984. And this is where the story of Galaxia starts, but we will now briefly return even more back in time. In 1960, Yugoslavia became one of the only 5 European countries at the time to autonomously develop its own digital mainframe computer, CER-10. It was the first digital computer in the south of Europe, the distinctive political position of the country, establishing the non-aligned countries movement and opening the new and third global position in the peak of the Cold War binarism, brought the Yugoslav scientists and engineers the collaboration with everybody interested, including both the Lomonosov University and IBM. But in the 1980s, Yugoslavia was lagging behind the wave of advancing personal computing. The country experienced a series of political and economical downturns and was at the time under the pressure of the foreign debt. As the living standard crumbled, the most significant obstacle became the high prices of Western products and components. Also, new regulations were introduced, barring the private import of any significant amount of foreign goods. It was the attempt by the state to halt the outflow of foreign currency under the pressure of crisis. But the people were not used to stay behind. A young engineer, Voja Antonić, addressed both problems. Important for our story, he was the student of film editing at the Faculty of Drama and self-educated himself to become an engineer. By hacking the processor and optimizing the code, Antonić came up with a complete and feasible solution for self-building a microcomputer using only the affordable components available on Yugoslav market. Restrained but also guided by the limitations, he found a way to use more than 100% of program memory and hack the processor to act as a video card at the same time. This approach managed to achieve the functionality and reduce the price of the Western solutions from the period. As in other places, the new technology was introduced through the old, and computers arrived carried by the magazines and radio. The potential of Antonić's invention was entangled with the enthusiasm of computer publicist Dejan Ristanović and radio host Zoran Modli, and the spirit of the distinct Yugoslav phenomena of New Wave. The timing happened to be absolutely synchronous with the emergence of the Apple campaign. As the 1984 ad was broadcasted in the States, the first issue and the blueprint for Galaxia appeared at kiosks in Yugoslavia. Both machines were presented in January of 1984. The instant acceptance and appeal of Galaxia, Galaxy, named after the popular science magazine where it was presented as a self-building project, was a consequence of both its innovative design and especially how the machine was distributed. Galaxia was offered as a do-it-yourself kit, available for mail orders. This is the first issue of Galaxia, a popular Yugoslav science magazine I grew up reading. Galaxia computer was named after it, as it was presented in the special edition of the magazine. The magazine editor Ristanović, who also helped in writing Galaxia code, saw the print run of the special issue titled Computers in Your Home quadruple to 120,000 copies. Beating the wildest estimations, at least 8,000 people wrote to order the kit or to confirm building their own computer. Then more institutions, individuals and companies started to be slowly included in the project. So this is how the hardware problem was being solved. There is a way now for each citizen to produce with a very modest financial investment and a moderate effort their very own personal computer. But what to do with it once assembled? The software remained to be solved. Here enters Zoran Modli, the host of the Ventilator 202 radio show, who had already experimented with broadcasts from various different locations such as cultural and youth clubs, concert venues, bookshops and streets. Being a licensed commercial pilot in 1981, he was allowed to run the very first live radio broadcast while flying a small airplane over Belgrade. He stated that this was his attempt to demystify both the idea of radio and of airplane by the same act. As a part of his mission to give the power of technology to the ordinary guy on the street, the software for Galaxia, alongside software for the other than popular platforms and very early versions of digital zines, would be shared in what was already a regular slot of the show, by being broadcasted in the form of noise over the radio waves to be recorded on compact cassettes and then loaded into the computers of the listeners. It worked so that Modli would announce what software will be played and for what platform, while the listeners were waiting at home for the countdown with their fingers on the recording button. 3, 2, 1, go. Once recorded, the noise played back to the computer would magically produce a new program or a new game. Modli started doing this for other platforms like Spectrum only several months before the Galaxia was introduced. The programming enthusiasts started writing software exclusively to be distributed in this way and mail the cassettes to the station. Antonić and his collaborators backed up the Galaxia project by writing some new software to be shared via radio at least once a week. While some thought it all sounds upsetting and terrifying and that the entire radio just broke, most of the population thought it is just another of the weird and crazy things the young generations do. Softvera emitovanih putem radio talasa. This is not the first time such things were done. In the early 1980s, a lot of radio stations in Europe made a successful attempt to broadcast software. Also, launching the machine via press and mail order kits was used elsewhere and before. What was probably unique was combining this and more into Galaxia ecosystem that was public and self-sustainable. As written in the introduction to the book Hacking Europe, From Computer Cultures to Demo Scenes, published in 2014, with a great and detailed text about Galaxia by the researcher Bruno Jakic. The development of independent Yugoslav software through the exchange of cassette tapes, radio broadcasts and transcriptions was similar to that in the Netherlands. But in Yugoslavia, the autonomy was hardwired. The architecture of the locally produced kits and computers was such that the software protection, either hacked from the US standards or locally produced, had to be removed before it could be installed. The thriving hacker scene in Yugoslavia was elitist, participated in a culture of alternative music and art, but was not driven by political motives. Galaxia appeared as the complete solution to introduce personal computers to general public by using the existing infrastructure at almost no costs. It presented an alternative concept on many levels. It was an alternative in regard to the policy of Yugoslav state that at the time restricted the import of technology. It presented an alternative in regard to the very history of technology by the early introduction of integrated video processor and using more than 100% of program memory. It used a wireless transfer of data in 1984. By eliminating copy protection on the level of hardware, Galaxia presented the alternative to the concept of developing personal computing through the regime of patents and copyright. The do-it-yourself approach of Galaxia also meant that no two units looked the same, expressing the skills and aesthetics of their makers and owners. There were all sorts of Galaxia casings made from plywood, from aluminium, from futuristic-looking plexiglass. A lot of the units probably stayed without a case, as it was easier to repair and improve the machine this way. Perhaps most important, Galaxia presented a massive and systematic educational campaign. The interest and knowledge in building hardware and software could be shared between experts, enthusiasts and population in a public, self-maintained and organic way. As Lily Lynch wrote several years ago in B-Turn magazine, alternate history aficionados, who usually spend their time pondering questions like what would have happened if the Aztecs had resisted Spanish colonization, have devoted significant time to speculating about an alternate reality in which the Galaxia exceeded Western models in popularity during the 1980s, saved Yugoslavia from dissolution, and made inexpensive microcomputer kits available to the Third World. Later, Antonić would go on to produce dozens of different projects that would be offered as public domain. However, the progressive tendencies of the early computer scene, described once again as elitist, a part of the culture of alternative music and art, but not driven by political motives, would not be reproduced. As the Galaxia project faded away, the computing industry would become based on imports and experts, Yugoslavia would soon disappear without alternative, and the computer scenes of newly created national states would follow the dominant trends of 1990s without history. Galaxia was about a particular form of socialness not available in the post-1989 global paradigm. I never patented anything, stated Voja Antonić. Of course there is hope, as there ever was. Guess what title is the most requested book ever since the foundation of British Library in 1997? The most requested book since opening in 1997 is The Production of Space by Henri Lefebvre, requested 701 times. Space as locus of production, as itself product and production, is both a weapon and a sign of this struggle. If it is to be carried through to the end, there is in any case no way of turning back. This gigantic task now calls for the immediate production or creation of something other than nature. A second, different or new nature, so to speak. This means the production of space, urban space, both as a product and as a work, in the sense in which art created works. If this project fails, the failure will be total, and the consequences of that are impossible to foresee. According to the Lefebvre's advice, the future is still as open and as possible as it ever was. Thank you.